bad.
What is up? Another episode of the Ripple Effect Podcast. Scott Horton is my guest today, host of the Scott Horton Show. He also hosts a show on AntiWar.com or AntiWar Radio. He also has an amazing book called Fool's Errand, Time to End the War in Afghanistan, which he's been on the James Corbett Report podcast to talk about. He's also recently been on Thaddeus Russell's podcast, which is called the Unregistered Podcast. Amazing conversation. Both interviews are well worth checking out, so please check those out. And fasten your seatbelt because we have an amazing podcast. Scott Horton's always a ball of knowledge. I love hearing him talk. He just puts out so much information, and I mean, to the point where sometimes you have to re-listen to a show or an interview just to kind of consume everything. And this show's no different. So hope you guys really enjoy it. One of the brightest minds when it comes down to foreign policy, politics, history, and all the above. So check that out. And what else? Thank you guys for the Patreon supporters. It always blows my mind that people are still listening to this show. And after 100 and whatever, 40 something shows, hours and hours and hours of me talking, that people still tune in and download. So I can't thank you guys enough for everybody who does do it. Obviously, I have a full-time job, and I have things just like the rest of you guys who are listening, priorities, and sometimes I get more sleep and less sleep, and sometimes I have more time or less time to research stuff and get mentally prepared for a show. And I think you guys appreciate that. There's probably going to be some shows where I'm going to be a little more tired, more up, more down, but that's because I'm just an average person like the rest of you guys who are overworked, underpaid, and probably sleep deprived. So but I think that's why we all relate to one another and why we all get along. I love my listeners. I love my people who contact me, some of the people who've been with me for so many years, and you know, they'll hit me up on Twitter or Facebook or wherever, and it's just amazing to see all these years later the people who have stuck with the show and watched it grow and been a part of this journey. And it's been absolutely a journey. It's been a blast and an honor to be able to do this. And financially, it hasn't been very rewarding, but in all other aspects, it absolutely has. And I can't thank you guys enough because, like I said, it blows my mind that people are willing to listen. And, you know, this many shows later and this many hours of me talking and rambling and ranting and sometimes not pronouncing things correctly and sometimes talking for too long and not letting the guests get something in. But I think with all my flaws, I think the one thing people enjoy about the show, that I'm always passionate, I'm always honest, and I always try to bring you guys the most interesting people who are also the same, passionately and honest, and trying to put out interesting information and topics and conversations. So thanks again, guys. Patreon supporters, if you want to support, obviously in the show notes, if you go on our YouTube channel, RV Theory 6, or just search the Ripple Effect Podcast, you'll find in the show description links to my Patreon page, my Theory 6 music, also my guest's book, his website, his show, all that stuff. It's always an easy way to get more information on myself or on the guest. Just go on YouTube and look at our show description, and the links are there. So that's it. Enjoy the show. Peace. Thanks for being with me. I really appreciate you taking time out of your day to be with me. I'm a huge fan of your podcast, and you've been on a bunch of podcasts that past guests that I've had, like your recent conversation with Thaddeus Russell, who's been on my show, and you know, you've been on James Corbett's show, he's been on my show a bunch of times. And so I'm just a huge fan of your work. I think you hit your first book, I believe, right? Fool's Errand on the Afghanistan war is I think amazing, because it is one of those things where we always call Korea the forgotten war. I feel like Afghanistan's gonna be the forgotten war because it's just like it's in the background. Nobody really talks about it. Nobody really knows the history. Nobody really knows why we're there, and we kind of it doesn't. I think that's a huge issue with war in general, is the fact that because I go to work, I take care of my chores, take care of my kids, my wife, everything just kind of, if we're in a war or out of a war, which is not often, but it doesn't matter how many wars we're in, my everyday life doesn't change much. And because of that, people just don't have that uproar of anger about what's going on overseas and stuff, because it's like, oh, we're still in the Afghan war, big deal. I still got to go to work tomorrow. I still got to mow the lawn. I still, and I think that's a huge issue. And I think a lot of information and images that uproared people during the Vietnam War, with people seeing images of dead bodies and getting those first reports of what was really going on. I think it really helped provoke some of the protests and all that stuff, where like today we're so suppressed. And I remember when Bush was talking about, when he was president, about not showing the caskets on the way back, and it was obvious that he was doing that not because of well, I mean, it's not obvious, I guess. In my opinion, he wasn't doing it because he actually felt bad for the families, but because he didn't want people to get upset, and he didn't want people to be like, oh, we need to stop this. And I don't think it was sincere reasons. And I think there's a huge issue with us being detached from war. And I think it was Stalin who said one death is a tragedy and a million deaths is a statistic. And I think that there's a lot of that going on, where one person gets, 2 people died in a Boston bombing, and it's like it's a huge deal, and we shut down the whole city, but hundreds and thousands of people die overseas, and we don't care. There's no uproar. There's no Afghanistan strong shirts or Iraq strong shirts, and or Yemen strong shirts. So I think it's a huge issue. So your message of being anti-war and constantly putting emphasis and attention on this stuff, to me, I think it is really important, because I think we can get so caught up in ideologies and politics and in history and all this stuff that we forget that there's wars going on, and regardless where they're from or what they believe, it's really important to understand that there's usually never a true justification to be there, and like you've said on your show, and you usually are creating terrorists in the process too. You're creating people who are going to hate your country, just like we would hate the Soviets if they had drones over our skies killing innocent people. So thank you so much for your work. I'm sure that I probably should have thrown a question in there somewhere, but actually I do remember you bringing up you being into skateboarding and stuff like that. I wonder, I don't know what type of music you listened to growing up. I don't know if you've ever mentioned it on an interview or a show, but where did this come from? This anti-war philosophy, and was it a skateboarding scene, being in a punk and very anti-government, very anti-establishment type of thinking, or was it something else?
Yeah, I mean, I guess that was part of it, but I'm not really sure, man. I guess. I had a lot of good left-wing and right-wing influences growing up. I live in Austin, Texas, so I could kind of take the best of the left and the right. There's a lot of libertarians in this town who, I think, people who, like me, grew up not having to feel like, or not feeling like we had to identify with one or the other, and take the best parts of both rather than the worst, maybe. And then, so I don't know. And then, when I was a teenager, they burnt Waco. And then they covered up the Oklahoma City bombing, which should have been impossible for them to allow all the people that helped McVeigh do that to get away with it. But they did, because people were distracted with O.J. Simpson instead. And so to me,
I love the fact that you brought that conversation up with the Thaddeus Russell conversation, because he's very he likes to put things in like a conspiracy theory category, but history's full of conspiracies, and it's full of corrupt people doing corrupt things and covering up their tracks for their own personal gains. And Oklahoma City is no different than than anything else, than not going to Vietnam for unjust reasons. And
it's a great example too of bogus conspiracy theories, because there are conspiracy theories that Al Qaeda did it, and that Iraq did it, and that Al Qaeda was like a variation of that. That Al-Qaeda was just a front for Iraq, and that was why they had done it, and this kind of thing too. So people will project whatever conclusions they want onto things, you know, especially traumatic events like that. But yeah, so in any case, I mean, and then, you know, Bill Clinton was, when I was old enough to join the Army leaving high school, Bill Clinton was occupying Bosnia and, you know, building NATO and all of this, you know, kind of, you know, Bill Clintonite liberal internationalist foreign policy that I, you know, automatically hated and never could have believed in, you know, at that point. Oh, because, you know, the first Gulf War and all that. I was for the first Gulf War because I was like 14 and it was just big explosions. And I didn't like Reagan and Bush, but I didn't care about Iraqis getting bombed either because I was just a stupid kid and I like fast jets and cool stuff. And so then, but shortly after that, by like 92, I had been completely disabused of the notion that that was anything but a wholesale slaughter of innocent people and that kind of deal. So that was just, you know, and the Reaganites selling cocaine and then locking up black people for using it all across America, and the massive drug war of the 80s and 90s, and you know, really all that stuff. A lot of George Carlin and Bill Clinton and Bill Hicks. I mean, Bill Clinton.
They both like to party, so
a lot of falling down hard on concrete, and so knowing what it's like to be in pain, I guess.
Yeah. I think you know, I think it's. Well, I know you also talked about Oklahoma City being one of the big things in your life where you realize, like, oh my God, this is obvious cover up. And you know, I think JFK is kind of a similar thing. I mean, it's much older, but I tell people all the time, I'm like, you look at the things that we know. The fact that there was people who conspired to shoot the president of the United States, democratically elected president of the United States, in broad daylight, blew off his head. There was obviously a cover-up, regardless who you think might have done it or whatnot. And it's like, if that can happen, then can't anything happen? And same thing with the war on drugs. Like, you know, I've had Rick Ross on. I mean, the fact that he was doing time for drugs that the CIA was flying in. I mean, and then obviously Gary Webb was one of the journalists that brought out the information that got Rick Ross out of jail. But I mean, the fact that the government will do that, I mean, it's fun.
On that point, can I just say real quick?
Absolutely.
There's a new Tom Cruise movie out.
Yeah, about Barry Seal.
Made, where he plays Barry Seal. And as part of they don't really talk about LA, but they do talk about how they had their secret airstrip, Vanilla Airstrip, near Mena, Arkansas, under the reign of Bill Clinton in the 1980s. All of those crazy, terrible conspiracy theories. Clinton compromised Clinton, Bush, and the CIA by Terry Reid. All of those stories confirmed now, finally. Oh, you're a kook if you say that the CIA was selling drugs, that George Bush Sr.'s government was selling cocaine, and that Governor Clinton in Arkansas was in on it. No way. And now, oh, it's 2017. Oh, yeah, of course, everybody knows that. Barry Seal and all of that. Everybody knows that story, don't you? And then, but now it's perfectly fine. Now it's just accepted, even though they never stop and say, oh, yeah, by the way, everyone who ever said this before was right, and we were lying when we said they weren't.
You make such a good point, because it's so funny how something is a conspiracy theory and you're a kook if you believe it, but then once it becomes public, then nobody acknowledges the fact that maybe we're just doing the same thing again with what we call new conspiracy theories. You know, it's the same thing. I mean, Alex Jones, obviously, you know, I do give him some credit because he was one of the first people talking about the Waco incident. He was there. He was at, you know, he talked about the Oklahoma City bombing. And obviously he's led to, I mean, obviously what he is now, I mean, is fear porn, kind of. But at one point, he did help. He was willing to kind of question things that was very taboo to question. And like you said, I think a lot of it is a emotional thing. I mean, if you bring up, you know, one of my favorite documentaries is 9/11 Press for Truth, because it talks about the Jersey girls and how they pushed for investigation that they weren't really willing to do in the first place, and to cover up. And it's you bring up 9/11, you bring up Oklahoma City bombing, and because we're still so emotionally attached to the situations, we remember how we felt. We remember people talking about it. Your first reaction is always like, no, they wouldn't cover that up. that up. No, they wouldn't let that happen. No, they wouldn't do that, you know. But it's like, but if we talk about something like JFK assassination, that's very, you know, far in the past, because we're not emotionally attached to it, because we don't remember how we felt, and people crying and all, and you know, all this stuff. It's much easier to accept that there's more to the story, and I think that's a huge issue, because
the same thing's happening now with Iraq War II, right? Where all the people who supported George Bush and supported torture and supported the war and shouted down everybody who knew better, now all of their emotional attachment to the Bush regime and its getting vengeance on our behalf after 9/11, all that's dissipated. Now they just miss their brother. Now they're just looking at the situation and saying, well, and look what's going on in Mosul now. It's a complete disaster. We did all of this, and for what? We turned this country into a den of terrorists, this country that never attacked us, that had no Al-Qaeda in it at all. We invade it, we turn it upside down, we fill it with terrorists, then we cleared them out, and then we left, and then now they're back. And so my brother died for this, and so now those feelings, before it was like, yeah, my brother died for this mission, and so it was like the sunk cost fallacy. That's how I know it was a valiant and brave thing, and you better not question it, or else you're attacking my brother. Where now they just miss their brother. Now they're over all of that stuff about, hey, I'm a pro-torture guy if George Bush says so, or whatever, and all that's gone. And now they're just left with the aftermath and looking at it and saying it was all for nothing, just like everybody who was anti-war back then told them it was in the first place. You know, back when they believed and back when they were shouting them down, which I'm not trying to rub their face in. I mean, I'm trying to say that basically like what you're saying is when the emotions about it change, when the connections in your head kind of change, when Obama is your commander in chief for 8 years, now you can think about it in a little bit different way. You know what I mean? We're like, would you take an order from that guy? That's kind of a whole different question, isn't it? You know, and then Donald Trump, he may be a right winger, but you got a lot of people asking the same question about him. You know, just because he thinks we need to have a war somewhere. Are you really willing to bet on that, on his judgment on that, just because he won the last election somehow or whatever it is, you know? So anyway, I totally agree with you. I think it's all a matter of social psychology. It's a matter of whether people are, you know, willing to face up to this particular fact or that one, and figuring out a way to come at them in a way where they will be willing to listen. I mean, like, for example, look at the narrative of the terror war. We got attacked by some Sunni radicals. Why? Because we were too close of allies with their governments that they hated and wanted to overthrow, right? None of them were from Iran, Iraq, Syria, Libya, the axis of evil countries that we hate, right?
Saudis, yep.
We're all from countries that were friends of ours. So then what do? We knock off Saddam Hussein, and we knock off Saleh, and we knock off Gaddafi, and we wage a half-assed regime change attempt against Assad for 5 years on behalf of all these jihadists, ultimately, as though, you know, if I've worn this one out now, but you could very easily be a reverse 9/11 truther and look at it that Bush and Cheney and Obama and Hillary have all been working for Al-Qaeda all of these years. And it's their agenda that our government is most faithful to at the expense of the American people. I mean, look at the rise of the Islamic State, which was Al-Qaeda in Iraq, which was virtually dead until Obama raised them back to life. And not because he's a Kenyan secret Muslim Brotherhood extremist, but because he's Bill Clinton. Because he's Ronald Reagan, he's, you know, this is what we do. We back the Saudis and their terrorists. That's our policy. And let's weaken Assad by using them. He brought the Frankenstein monster back to life, Al-Qaeda in Iraq, which was virtually eliminated by the local tribes, not by David Petraeus, in the later years of Iraq War II. And Obama saved him. And not only did he save him, he saved him so big, he turned the Islamic State from the name of a group to the name of a place that for a while erased the border between Iraq and Syria, and created a literal bin Ladenite state that could have never existed, but for George Bush and Obama handed it to him on a silver platter. So, and you know what? That's just true, right? That's nothing even approaching conspiracy theory. That's reading the paper every day for the last 15 years, okay? That's what just happened. We just waged war against a bunch of secular dictators on behalf of a bunch of Islamists. And then it's true that we have also backed the Shiite death squads in their war against the Sunni death squads that we helped, and back and forth again. We just finished beating the Islamic State that we actually had put in power there. And so on it goes. Now, if you say this to should be anyone in America, they ought to be able to, I can see you nodding along with me right now. Anyone in your family, anyone on your block ought to be going, yeah, I mean, I remember that, right? We did attack Iraq for no reason and overthrow the government in Yemen and start this horrible war there. And we did do actually, I have had people say to me, we had a war against Libya? Yeah, man, 2011, remember? The crazy Colonel Gaddafi, you don't remember? Yeah. No, last time they know we attacked Libya was Ronald Reagan in 1984. You know, they don't even know. But anyway, most people do. Some people don't. But it's, as you said, you can go to work every day and mow your lawn on the weekend and watch your game and not even really have heard of the Libya war unless you're really paying attention. That could have escaped you if you're just living a normal life. You know, I don't want to blame people too bad. I support them living normal lives. I just, you know, it's sad that that's the extent of the neglect of what's going on here.
Well, I think
well, right now they claim radical Islam. They're coming to get us. Look at all these terrorists. There's 40,000 of them now. Yeah, well, there were 400 on September 11th, and there were about 200 on December 15th, 2001, and now there's 40,000 of them. Whose fault is that?
Especially when you look at how much money we spend on intel, defense. I mean, it should be Department of War. I mean, I like how they changed the name to Department of Defense because it doesn't sound as bad. But really, it should go back to the Department of War because that's actually what they're doing. They're not defending us. They're creating wars. And you know, like you said, there is a huge issue with people just kind of going along their daily lives and they don't ask questions, and we're told. But a lot of this is culture, because you look at, like, we live in a world where the two things you never argue about, or you should not argue about, you never talk about. It doesn't necessarily, not even if you can have a civil conversation, they assume it's going to eventually lead to an argument. So you never bring up religion or politics. And it's funny because I tell people this all the time. I'm like, listen, I can get in an argument with somebody about sports to the point where we're almost at it, like ready to kill each other, but that's completely acceptable. And if people, every time we get our buddies together, we can fight all day about sports, and nobody ever says we shouldn't talk about sports. But if we bring up politics and we get in one little, disagreement, it's like, oh, that's why you don't bring up politics, because you're arguing. And I think, it's such a dangerous way of living, because the conversations that we should be having, that we should be figuring out and resolving and sharing ideas, those are the ones that we're told not to have. And we're told to talk about this pointless thing that really is just entertainment. It doesn't matter who wins or loses. And it's funny, I'm saying this with a Celtic shirt on, but I understand that when at the end of the day, when I get home and I watch the Celtics against the Thunder, it's literally just a way of getting my mind off, work and priorities and all these other things that I'm stressed about. But it's pointless. But you still need some time to think about what's really going on, because if not, then we become sheeple. We're just going along with the herd, and we never question anything, and we never ask. And that's exactly what whoever people think is pulling the strings, that's exactly what they want. They want us to continue giving them our tax money, not asking questions of where it's going, and just continue living our lives while they decide what to do and what we should or shouldn't do. I think it was George Carlin who said, if voting mattered, they wouldn't let us do it. And I've never voted. I think when I was a kid and I first got more politically aware of what was going on, I was more Democratic. I kind of lean towards Democrats and liberals, because I'm like, I like their social perspectives. I like the fact that they're trying to give everybody freedoms, and they're sticking up for gays and women who want to have abortions and minorities. And then as you get older, you realize, holy shit, I've been tricked, and none of it means anything to anybody, and it doesn't matter who's in power. It's the same old. And I remember watching the documentary The Trials of Henry Kissinger by Christopher Hitchens, and it was you had Kissinger, who worked with Republicans and Democrats. It didn't matter, and he was and basically it really exposed the fact that all the foreign policy advice he had or have given, or while he was in office having some influence on foreign policy, it was all for bullshit. It was never for the reasons they told us publicly. And even Christopher Hitchens, and talking about emotions affecting your judgment, Christopher Hitchens is a pretty good example, because he was that movie and his book seemed very anti-war, hey, war's a racket, like Smedley Butler says, and it's all bullshit. And then when the Iraq War came around, he was all for the Iraq War because of his hatred towards Muslims and religious people, because he was this atheist, very popular atheist. And so it shows that even somebody as intelligent as Christopher Hitchens, was fooled into thinking the Iraq War was a just war because of his emotions. And I think that's something that's, I've had Hunter Motz on my show a bunch of times, and he says, most of us think that we make decisions, or we look at the facts, then we decide, we make a decision. But the truth is, we make a decision, then look at the facts to back that decision. And I think that's something that's very hard to kind of keep up with, and you have to constantly keep self-reflecting and reanalyzing what you believe and why you believe things to make sure you don't accidentally go down that road. And you do a great job of doing that. Like you said, when you were younger, you were willing to take the best parts of both sides. How do you think you did that without accidentally falling into one ideology or the other?
Hate.
What do you mean specifically?
Well, I mean, just ain't nobody right compared to me, and so I don't feel any, and that's the way I look at it. So I don't feel any need to have to sign on with anybody else's agenda. And I've repeated this before, but I don't mind saying that George Carlin was a big inspiration to me, or at least he was important to me on a few different things, but in the Jammin' in New York special of 1992, he comes out and completely destroys the Iraq War, and he completely the first Iraq War, and he completely destroys the pretension that we're supposed to have to believe in these guys. Are you kidding me? And he just completely ruins that for the audience, and beautifully. And then the whole middle is all about riding on an airplane, and do you ever look at your watch and then you don't know what time it is, and then you look again, and all this kind of cool stuff. And then at the end, he attacks liberals and their bicycle paths and their Earth Day and their recycling and all of their little, self-interested, pat yourself on the back kind of morality. And they don't really care about other people's problems. Look at all the things that they don't mention and all of this and how the Earth is going to be fine and blah, blah, blah. The Earth plus plastic, who cares? Blah, blah, blah. So anyway, to me, that was just a great example of, first of all, George Carlin, who's the wisest teacher in the society, basically, saying to a 14-year-old who's never had to choose before that you don't have to choose left or right. You don't have to be a hippie, and you don't have to be a suit and tie wearing Christian business owner either. You could just be yourself and hate them all. And plus, I was a skateboarder anyway. As you said, I was already, a little bit outside of probably what would have fit into any kind of neat categories. So I never really felt I had to believe that. So, but in the 1990s, you mentioned Alex Jones was good on Waco. He was really good on Waco. I mean, he helped organize people on his radio show to come together to rebuild the Branch Davidians church on that same site. And so at that time, during that same time, I had no problem hanging around with militia guys and right-wing patriots and John Birchers and conspiracy kooks, whatever. And they weren't, I don't know exactly how that kind of movement is now, but back then they weren't really racist at all. They were just no more Waco's types. And, they were kind of right-wing and populist, but perfectly good people and fine for me to hang out with. And, James Bovard is a great exception. But as far as I knew at the time, mostly the libertarian movement didn't give a damn about the Branch Davidians, didn't care about the Gulf War illness, didn't care about the truth about the Oklahoma City bombing, didn't care about the sanctions against the Iraqi people, all things that Jones and people like him and like the Birchers were great on in the 1990s. And so, at Reason Magazine, I won't name names, but at Reason, they specialized in debunking the effect of the sanctions on Iraqis and debunking the Gulf War illness and all these things that were, the most terrible and most important issues of the 1990s. And they were going, oh, we're so reasonable and skeptical that we don't believe in this mass hysteria, whatever, when really they're abetting the state and their very worst actions. So I didn't have much use for what I knew of the libertarian movement to be. I didn't really realize the extent of the libertarian movement and that there were people in the libertarian movement who were really great on these things. So I was much more, I was perfectly happy to hang around with a bunch of right-wingers. It never made me right-wing in any way, but I'm perfectly happy to run around with them, just the same as I'm perfectly happy to run around with a bunch of communists, which I've done too, and a lot of Earth Firsters and Black Bloc anarchists and whatever. I've shared pirate radio stations with those guys and whatever, and in the past, Free Radio Austin and on Radio Chaos, and they're good on a lot of things, and they're bad on a lot of things too, but they smoke weed. They're cool guys. I don't care. So And my thing really is, and I do want to convert the world to libertarianism, but first I want to convert everybody to anti-warism. And then, so that way, you don't have to agree with me on everything. If you like your identity, you can keep it, man. You might be a Christian, you might be atheist. I don't know. I'm not really worried about that. I hope you're not too worried about whether I am or not. The point is anti-war first. This is the most important thing, regardless of whatever else you believe. And I think if you're a good conservative, then, man, you should be really anti-war. And if you're a good liberal or progressive, certainly any kind of leftist, then this has got to be your top priority. I mean, what the hell are we doing allowing this to continue? And I think, this is why I thought Ron Paul was so important. I say this all the time. I'm sure people are getting bored of hearing me say it, but it's important to me that what Ron Paul did, remember the Giuliani moment, it wasn't just that he won a fight against Giuliani. The fight that he won against Giuliani was that George Bush Sr. and Bill Clinton brought on the 9/11 attack by bombing Iraq from bases in Saudi Arabia for a decade straight. And come on, everybody knows we've been bombing them for 10 years before they hit us and hit our towers. And the audience in the crowd hated it, but he didn't back down. Giuliani tried to make him back down. He goes, no, the CIA are the ones who teach this. The word is blowback, severe consequences. And if you think you can go around the world doing what you want and not have real consequence, then you're basically deceiving yourself at your own peril. We're putting our own society at risk, thinking we can get away with being a world empire, that we won't have to suffer real consequences. And look, and this is a hard pill to swallow. This is a Republican candidate for president when Bush was still the sitting president of the United States. And Ron Paul said that, and they loved it. Well, okay, a lot of people hated it, but 20 million people loved it immediately, overnight. Everybody changed their MySpace picture to Ron Paul. And everybody said, look at this Republican, Protestant, conservative, still married to his first wife, country doctor, Republican congressman, did I already say Republican congressman from Texas, who's saying to me, in effect, you don't have to be Michael Moore, the big fat communist hypocrite millionaire. You don't have to be Susan Sarandon or some left-wing Hollywood know-nothing blowhard. You could be a white, right-wing, conservative, Republican congressman from Texas and absolutely not believe in the war, disbelieve in the war, be far more anti-war than Michael Moore. And just here you go. He basically signed everybody a permission slip. He gave him a hall pass. He said, if you like your identity, you can keep it. You go to church every Sunday, you can be anti-war. You're a MMA boxer, you can be anti-war. You're a right-wing, you like country music, you can be anti-war. You don't have to believe, you won't have to worry about people thinking that you are now with Thelma and Louise, culturally speaking. That was what he told them, and they loved it. 20 million of them at once said, okay, attack the right from the right, blam. Defeated 20 million of, well, defeated, but, won over 20 million people said, that old man is telling me the truth. He respects me enough to tell me the truth about what's going on here. And they went for it right away. And the real, going back to what you said at the beginning here, the whole construct is social psychology, making it okay for people to keep a hold on who they believe they are, but still being able to change their idea on one issue. I used to get really mad at people who were against the Iraq war. Now I'm really mad at the people who made me really mad at them. Damn it, you got me. But now I'm over it. That was okay, tough pill to swallow, but now I'm all right again. And now I'm anti-war. And there are a lot of people like that, man. I mean, look, we're having this conversation in 2017. I got I don't know, some substantial proportion of my audience, which is absolutely unapologetically anti-war on every single issue under the American empire and then some, are veterans, and a lot of them are combat veterans. I mean, I just went on this cruise with Tom Woods and Bob Murphy on the Contra cruise there, and there was a former Green Beret, a former veteran of the Afghan war, who I wrote about his company in my book, although he, not personally him, but he was there. And there was an active duty Army guy with us. And all three of them told me, yeah, you're doing the right thing. Yeah, you're right on. And I was joking with them that, I could stand to be contradicted. If you want to tell me I'm missing an important point here, GI, I'm listening. And their attitude was like, no, man, I've been there. I've seen this stuff. The Green Beret had been there for all of Iraq War III, the last year, from the beginning of the final assault on the city of Mosul up until its liberation, and then, I guess they did rock after, but he was there with the Peshmerga, with the Iraqi army, all the way through Iraq War III. And, these are guys with, real combat experience, and they're listening to what I'm saying, and they're saying, yep. I wish that wasn't true. Like, honestly, I don't care about being right. I really am over it. Go ahead, and if you're right and I'm wrong, I'll admit it. And I was asking them, go ahead and tell me about all the good stuff that I'm missing out on here and why it matters. And they're like, meh.
Yeah, it's amazing how many people are anti-war after they've experienced it. I mean, the majority of veterans, and that's probably has a lot to do. A contributing reason could be the fact that we're super patriotic when we're sending them there, but when they come back, we could care less. And I think it's like 1 out of every 4 homeless people is a veteran. I mean, we should be cringing when we hear shit like that. I mean, if that statistic is even close to the truth, we should be outraged. I mean, these people are sent overseas for, regardless if we know that it's not just causes, they got accidentally tricked or whatever, some propaganda convinced them that they were doing something for the right reasons, but their hearts were probably, in the most part, in the right places, where they really were convinced that they were doing it to protect their loved ones back at home. And then they come back and it's like, oh yeah, sorry about your PTSD, oh sorry the fact that you lost a couple limbs, oh yeah, and I know it's public knowledge now that the Iraq war was we probably shouldn't have been there, it was a fuck up, but we'll go on with our lives. And oh yeah, well, I know that you can't go on with your life because you don't have a leg now, or you don't have your mental stability to have a job or whatever. And it's like, we should be fucking outraged. Like, the fact that we let another Vietnam happen, and I forget who said it, like, the next war starts when people who remember the last one are gone. And I'm not even sure that's even accurate, but the point remains, I think, true. The fact that once we forget about, we have like awful long-term memory, and it's like we get all worked up for every 4 years for election, and then we don't care, and we get all worked up about a war for a little bit, and then we don't care. And Iraq happened, and I think there was pushback initially to go in Syria, but they use the chemical weapons talk. They use and I tell people, I'm like, do you think it's a fucking coincidence that initially when we wanted to go in Syria, everybody pushed back, and then they're like, okay, well, the people are really upset, so now we got to give them a reason to be upset with these Syrian people or the Syrian government. Now all of a sudden they're talking about chemical weapons, they're showing beheadings. It's like, do you think this is a coincidence? It's like, no, man, this is Joseph Goebbels using propaganda to sell you something.
And the beheadings were the good guys. The beheadings were the guys that America was backing against the secular state there.
And they didn't tell you that. No. They just showed the beheadings just to get people outraged. And most people don't even know the difference between one side or the other. They don't know what the fuck's going on. I mean, I would tell people all the time, like, you do realize that first of all, the fact that the moderate rebels, the fact that term was used and people actually regurgitated that, like, that made any sense. Like, how do you fucking know there's what's a moderate rebel? So was there a survey, like a yes and no survey, like, hey, would you shoot a puppy? Or it's like, well, how do you know what's a moderate rebel? And then it's like, even if there was a such thing as moderate rebels, how would you? There's no way of knowing one from the other. The extreme rebels to the moderate rebels. There's no way of knowing who's getting the guns, who's getting the weapons, who's getting the money, and they just send this stuff over there. People who was falling for this propaganda would just say, yeah, well, we're funding the moderate rebels because we want to take down the government and blah 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 and all this stuff. But so obviously you've done much more research. You're one of the brightest minds when it comes down to knowing what's going on with geopolitics and foreign policy. What is it? Is it a pipeline in Syria? What is it that's causing all this intervention and us wanting to get involved in there and Afghanistan? Because I mean, obviously Afghanistan is the longest running war in American history. And nobody knows why we're there. I mean, obviously, there's an epidemic of heroin, especially I live in the East Coast of Massachusetts, and we've been hit hard with the heroin epidemic, and it's obviously very common and it's everywhere. And I wonder the link between us being in Afghanistan and protecting these poppy fields and the heroin coming to the U.S. And I think I remember reading somewhere not too long ago about the percentage of heroin that was coming from Afghanistan today compared to before we went there. And I mean, what do you think is actually the motivating cause of our intervention in these countries?
Well, I mean, overall, the policy is dominance of the planet Earth. That America will never allow any power or any combination of powers to be able to even think for a minute that they could challenge our military superiority. So even if they gain economically in this way or that way, they better not even dream of challenging our naval supremacy over the seas and oceans of the planet. They better not ever dream of putting together an air force that could even begin to repel American dominance over their countries for any extended period of time, or we'll attack them first. We'll make sure that it never gets to that point. And that's really the policy ever since 1992 in the aftermath of the Gulf War, the defense planning guidance, where they said, this is it, no near-peer competitors ever. And of course, the only possible near-peer competitors would be Russia and China, or I guess Europe, if they all combined as an enemy of ours. And of course, at that time, you heard a lot of talk about, oh no, maybe Germany and Japan are going to become the new enemy again for making friends with the Russians. I don't know if you remember that, back in the early 1990s. But so that was a real fear. I think they just didn't know what was going to happen. And so they were afraid that without the Soviet Union and communist China to be the enemy to push everybody under everybody else into America's orbit, that everybody was going to spin out. And so they had to basically make the move to double and triple down and expand their base presence around the world and expand all the international institutions and their influence as much as they could to get the world centered on the American imperial system, which has as a huge part of it the institutions of global governance, which are basically the institutions of American imperial power, only with our satellites in Europe and wherever else get to sit on the boards of directors of them too. But it's basically the era of the American empire. So this is the policy in Korea and in Japan and in Vietnam. And this is the policy in the Middle East. And this is the policy in Europe, West and East. And this is the policy in Latin America, although they pay, varying amounts of attention to Latin America at any given time. And I admit that I'm not the best at keeping up with those, but we're always screwing around down there with somebody.
Yeah, it does seem like that.
See, America is England. And no one is allowed to be outside of the rule of our redcoats. That's it. And so why do we hate Iran? Why do we hate North Korea? Why do we hate Cuba? Is because they're independent from us. That's it. They declared independence. They declared that you cannot dominate us. You will not pick our governments. You will not determine our policy for us. And so that makes them a threat. Look at what we're talking about. We're talking about Iran and North Korea and Cuba. No, they are not a threat at all. What they are is strong enough for now to maintain their independence from us. And so that makes them, the devil on earth that must be at least contained, if not preempted and destroyed. So now things like Afghan heroin, you're damn right. Quantities and qualities of Afghan heroin have, come to, they've gone from, I guess they say 70 to 90% of global supply. And then, of course, total global supply is also through the roof. And this is the Taliban side and the insurgent side, as well as the side that the sides that the American government backs there as well, and they're different factions. And basically, the entire economy of Afghanistan is dependent on heroin. So, honestly, man, I wrote a whole book about this, about the Afghan war, when it came to the heroin chapter, I really had to give short shrift to what I think is what you're really getting at and what is really important to me as well, which is what exactly are the channels that this heroin is going through and where all is it coming from? Like, we know historically about the French Connection and the Golden Triangle, and we know, as we talked about, Contra cocaine coming into Los Angeles and this kind of thing. But by what mechanism exactly is all this heroin getting distributed around the world, and which banks are involved in it and which Republicans are involved in it, et cetera? I really don't know. I really wish I did know. I'm willing to bet that Peter Dale Scott is the one who can answer those questions best. And I just, honestly, man, I read about 20 books in the process of writing my book. and his wasn't one of them. He's got 2 or 3 on, different aspects of the terror war, and I just didn't, those were on the bottom of the list, and I didn't get to them. So there's no question that Afghan heroin is involved in increasing overall global supply. Just like oil, it's a fungible resource anyway, right? But so there's now what they call an epidemic, which may be overstated, I don't know. But what they call an epidemic is now spreading. It's in China and Russia and in Europe, as well as the United States. And around the world, the global supply of black market heroin is increasing. And because Afghanistan has been at war for 40 years now, they basically have no other real economy. And it's half of their economy, half of the entire GDP of the country is the heroin market. And again, that's both sides are completely dependent on it. All our governors and cops and all the Taliban resistance as well. So, and then when it comes to Syria, I think, my best information is that it's not the pipeline, because the pipeline deal had basically already been canceled. So that story, and Robert Kennedy Jr. actually is the guy that wrote a big thing about this for Politico, I think it was, a couple of years back. And he talks about the 2 competing pipelines. So the Saudis wanted to build one from Saudi through Jordan and through Syria to Turkey, and then I guess to Europe from there. And then the Iranians, though, they wanted to build one through what's now Shiite-controlled Iraq ever since America's Iraq War II, 2003 through 10 or 11 there. So they wanted to build their pipeline through Iraqi Shiistan and through their friendly Assad government's, Alawite/Shiite-controlled Ba'athist regime in Syria, and then from there to the Mediterranean, and from there on to Europe. And so these were the competing pipeline plans. Now, Gareth Porter has written that don't put too much stock in that, because really the Iranian side already knew that they really couldn't do it, because they would still, even if they had their pipeline through Iraqi Shiistan, they would still be hung up when they got to Anbar province. They wouldn't be able to provide security for the pipeline across Iraqi Sunnistan, what's left of the Sunni regions, predominantly Sunni regions of the country, to get to Syria. So he was saying that they had already given up on that before the Arab Spring and the hijacking of the Arab Spring ever really started. So I'm willing to take Gareth's word for it if he says that that's like overstated as a cause of the war. I think ultimately what's really going on here is the Saudi, but more importantly, the Likud government in Israel, the Netanyahu government in Israel's preoccupation with Iran and Iranian power. And right as Barack Obama was making the nuclear deal with Iran, was finally getting down in his second term to, I guess it still was in the first term, but he had decided he was going to try to get a nuclear agreement with them. And then so much of the rest of his policy then became a way to placate the Israelis and placate the Saudis while he was making a deal with Iran, to let it be clear that we're not tilting back toward Iran like it was in the 70s or anything. But what we are doing is we're taking the nuclear issue off the table. And so, but the Israelis and the Saudis feared that that meant that their role in America's order over there was being threatened. And so how do you make them feel better about that? Well, you tell the Israelis especially, don't worry, we'll get rid of Assad in Syria. And then, of course, the Saudis, too. And then the worst part of that, even, well, as bad at least as the Syrian war, is the other half of that is the promise to Saudi that we would back them in the war in Yemen, which has taken place over the last 2.5 years there. But I think, I guess, honestly, man, the CIA had been screwing around in Syria for so long, I don't think they needed a real reason to start it anymore. I think in 2011, when the Arab Spring started, the Saudis and the Americans kind of panicked and said, we got to do whatever we can to get out in front of this thing and co-opt it to get rid of the leaders we don't like and stifle it in places where we certainly don't want it, right? So they don't want to see any Arab Spring in Kuwait, Saudi, or Bahrain. But really in Yemen, they didn't want to see one either, or Egypt, that it got out of control there. But in Libya and in Syria, they said, we can hijack this. We can appropriate the Arab Spring for our own purposes and get rid of these leaders that we don't like. And so really the Israelis, I guess, I don't know if they were on board from the very beginning, but they very quickly got on board. And their former ambassador, Michael Oren, had even explained out loud, he told this to the Jerusalem Post, And then he also is on video. If you just type in Oren, O-R-E-N, Sunnis, you can hear Michael Oren, the former Israeli ambassador to the United States, say, and we always preferred these bad guys to those bad guys. We always preferred, even in his words, the Islamic State, Al-Qaeda and the Islamic State, not the mythical moderate rebels, but even the worst of the bad guys. We still prefer them to Assad. And why? Because Assad is backed by Iran, and Assad is backed by Hezbollah, and that's what we care about. And he makes, he makes direct reference, because he's actually saying this right after, like 3 weeks after the declaration of the Islamic State in Mosul in June of 2014, right? So we don't just have Al-Qaeda terrorists fighting in Syria. Now the Islamic State has gone from the name of a group to the name of a place. And then 2 or 3 weeks later, Michael Oren is with Jeffrey Goldberg at the Aspen Fancy Pants Conference, or whatever they call it up there, you know, the high society expert people. And he gets up there and he says, yeah, ISIS, or he doesn't say ISIS by name, but he goes, yeah, these guys, they just massacred 1,700 enemy men in the field. Well, he's talking about ISIS when they seized Camp Speicher, which was where the Iraqi Air Force was training in Iraq, and where they had taken 1,700 men and machined them all to death. There was video of it. Just have them laying bound in a parking lot and just massacred them all with machine guns. And he makes direct reference to ISIS and says, well, still, at least they're not backed by Iran. And then actually his excuse is hilarious. His excuse is because look at Assad. He's responsible for every single death in the war. And so, geez, do the math. Oh, and by the way, the Iranians have military nuclear technology that they could give to Hezbollah, which of course is complete nonsense, which is an absolute fairy tale. But this is the Israeli rationalization for why the allies, their allies, including the U.S., are and ought to be backing the Al-Qaeda terrorists in Syria, is because the enemy's backed by Iran. And so now I mentioned Jeffrey Goldberg. Michael Oren is explaining this to Jeffrey Goldberg of The Atlantic magazine. Well, Obama, the title of the article is, As President, I Don't Bluff. And he gave an interview to Jeffrey Goldberg. And the promise there is, I promise, I won't let Iran get a nuclear weapon. Trust me, man, I'm not trying to give them one. I'm trying to stop them from ever getting one. Give me a break here, okay? And that's the thrust of the article is, you know, Goldberg is basically Obama's ombudsman to the Likud community in America and in Israel, the right-wing nationalists. And one of the things that happens is Goldberg says to Obama, he says, well, you know, if we got rid of Assad, that would be a good way to take Iran down a peg, right? And Obama says, yeah, that's exactly what we're doing now, is we're trying to weaken Assad because that's a way to weaken Iran, because Assad's Syria is the last allied state of Iran in the region. And I could tell you more, Jeffrey, but then I'd have to kill you. Ha, ha, ha. And he makes the little joke about we're undergoing covert action right now for this purpose.
He says that?
He says that. Actually, you know what? I'm misparaphrasing it, but it's the closest thing you can get to I'd tell you, but I'd have to kill you. But it's like, but you're not read into the secret covert folder or whatever it is. Like something where it's like a cutesy little way of referring to covert action like that. Very close to that. And again, that you can double check the substance of what I say. The article is As President, I Don't Bluff from 2012 in The Atlantic. Obama and Goldberg.
That's wild. I mean, that's the thing is but the history of it too. I mean, that's why I think history is so important, because I mean, even Afghanistan, I mean, it's been taken over by the Brits. You know, the British went there, and it just obviously the Soviets went there. And you know, all this history, it kind of helps people understand why certain, like I always say, like if you can follow the road backwards, you can figure out how it got paved to this exact spot. You know, you follow it backwards and be like, oh, this is how we got here. You know, same thing with North Korea. I mean, I've talked to people many of times where I'm like, yeah, I get all the reasons why you think North Korea is the worst place ever. I get it. But let's not ignore the fact that some of the reason why they hate us is because we fucking carpet bombed the shit out of that country, and we killed tons of people. I mean, I forget what percentage of the population, but it was like some ridiculous amount of the population we just fucking killed. And So it's not really hard to make them hate us. It's not. And that's why they're getting anti-America propaganda right from a young age and sold us. And I mean, obviously they are crazy and all that stuff, but you can't look at one side without looking at the other side of the coin. And same thing with Cuba. I mean, you look at Castro's Cuba. I mean, before that, people didn't like Batista. They didn't like the way things were going, and he was a piece of shit and doing a lot of deals with American businessmen and politicians. And I tell people, they're like, oh, but Cubans hate Castro, and I'm like, no, the Cubans in America hate Castro because those are the ones who left. But you can't have a revolution unless you have people on your side. And guess what? People were on your, there's enough people on his side to have that revolution. South America is a whole nother thing with like the schools of Americas. I've talked to people about the schools in Americas, and they're just like, what? Wait, what? They're like, this is a American school that has trained rebel forces and guerrilla groups. I'm like, yeah, and we're paying for that shit. Your tax money is paying for that. And
Noam Chomsky, put out a book years ago, I guess in the early 1990s. It was called The Washington Connection and Third World Fascism. And it's like this thick. And it's just an encyclopedia of all the right-wing fascist dictators that America supports that just butcher whoever to death to turn over all their mineral wealth or whatever it is to the U.S. And why do they hate us? Empire, man, come on. How would we feel if somebody else's empire ruled our country? We just get used to it and be like, all right, well, I guess it's okay. Or what? You know what I mean?
Oh, well, Vice News, they had a article, I remember a couple years ago, about how many possible terrorists are created after every drone attack. And, and I'm like, I don't even need statistics to understand that. I mean, just common sense will tell you that if I'm at a coffee shop with my wife and kids having a croissant and a coffee, and then all of a sudden they're trying to kill the guy next to me and they accidentally kill my wife and kids, when a terrorist group comes into town saying, hey, we're recruiting people to fight these Americans, I'll be the fucking first one there, So it's
no, you got it all wrong. That's a surgical strike, see? As opposed to Bush marching the entire 3rd Infantry Division into Iraq, anything less than that is a surgical strike. And yet, of course, you're completely debunking that, right? You're saying, no, you kill a handful of innocents. You just created 2 or 3 handfuls of insurgent fighters or worse as a result. And you know what? This is in the book. Stanley McChrystal, who is the first general in charge of Obama's surge in Iraq, and who had helped do a lot of the Special Operations Command. He was in charge of Special Operations Command, or JSOC, in Iraq War II. He called this insurgent math. This was his thing. In fact, Mike Flynn, who was Trump's first national security advisor, got fired in all the scandal and whatever. He ridiculed anything less than a full counterinsurgency people's war where you send your entire infantry to befriend all the nice people and take over their entire society for them until they fall in love with you and then tattletale on all the bad guys for you and all this, which is his ridiculous dream. But then he very correctly criticized, he said, anything short of that, you don't even know who you're killing. If you're not getting really good information from the people in the neighborhood, all you're doing basically is taking your best guess. And he ridiculed that as mere, worthless or worse, counterproductive anti-insurgency. Oh, anti-insurgency. That's how an idiot fights. That's counterproductive. All you're going to do is make more enemies. What we got to do instead is a full-fledged counterinsurgency. Now, his answer, of course, is also insane and crazy and wrong. But his diagnosis that so he gives it this slander term, this smear term, anti-insurgency, which falls so far short of what is really necessary to have good enough intelligence to wage a scalpel enough war that you only kill bad guys without generating all these new enemies, which is the greatest danger of any of this so-called kinetic action. You kill innocent people, you generate, as you say, you don't need statistics, you already know this. But then again, my point just being, the commanders of the war know this. McChrystal and his right-hand man, Flynn, they called it insurgent math. They called it anti-insurgency, counterproductive anti-insurgency, the wrong way to fight a war, going around killing people, pretending that you're eliminating terrorists when really you're just generating them. And then, of course, to me, the key to all of this is that how come these guys aren't still our friends when they were our friends during Ronald Reagan? And the answer is because George Bush and Bill Clinton betrayed them. And then even though Bill Clinton supported them in Bosnia and supported them in Kosovo and supported them in Chechnya, still, that didn't buy them off. They're still our enemies because we still support Israel. We still had bases in Saudi Arabia that we were bombing Iraq from. And then so that's why the Mujahideen aren't our friends anymore like they were in the Ronald Reagan years when they made Rambo 3 when I was a kid. And these were the heroic Mujahideen, God-fearing freedom fighters taking on the horrible, godless, atheist, communist Soviet Union that had invaded their Muslim land, in which America was 100% in their corner and on their side in all of that. You know, we made them our enemy. Our government made them our enemy by attacking and killing them. And all of this started back not with Bush Jr., but with Bush Sr., not with Hillary Clinton, but with Bill Clinton. And then ever since, even though Obama, again, he's tried to side with them and took their side in Libya and in Syria. Did that buy them off? No. We've seen Al-Qaeda and ISIS attacks on Western targets, you know, in Europe and in the United States, inspired in the United States, but actual Al-Qaeda guys and ISIS guys in attacks in Europe that have taken place just in the last few years because, you know, we keep making them our enemies anyway, no matter how much we befriend them. I mean, look at what happened to Ambassador Stevens in the Benghazi thing. Everyone misses the point about Benghazi. Like the point is that Obama himself didn't fly in the middle of the firefight and rescue these guys when it was the military's job to do that. And that's not how they operate, man. They come in tomorrow in the daytime and find out what happened. They're not just going to fly a bunch of guys in the middle of a firefight when they don't know what's going on and who's who and whatever like that. But look at the scandal that got completely buried under all that, which was, what the hell was Ambassador Stevens and the CIA house down the street? What were they doing in Benghazi? The capital is in Tripoli, right? What were they doing over there? They were funneling a bunch of guns and terrorists to Syria is what they were doing. They were working with the Qataris to finance and arm a bunch of terrorists. And so then Hillary Clinton, I guess, had convinced Obama that, yeah, it's perfectly fine to ally with these Al-Qaeda terrorists because we're allying with them, right? When their point of view is, hey, cool, an American, thanks for the guns. And then they kill him. And in fact, I'll tell you one thing. Nobody ever mentions this about this, and I hate to admit it, but it was Rachel Maddow who got this right about the Benghazi attack right away in 2012. She goes, here's what happened. And she wasn't blaming Obama. She was just saying, there was an Al-Qaeda, a Libyan Al-Qaeda fighter named Sheikh Yahya al-Libi, who was killed by an Obama CIA drone strike in Pakistan in July of 2012. And shortly after that, Ayman al-Zawahiri put out a podcast saying, hey, all you loyal Al-Qaeda guys fighting in Libya, and you've got Americans among you. Well, it's time to get some revenge for your buddy, Sheikh Yahya al-Libi, who, it turns out, by the way, was the brother of Sheikh Ibn al-Libi, who was tortured by George Bush into pointing the finger at Saddam Hussein for pretending that he had trained Al-Qaeda how to make chemical weapons and hijack airplanes, which Colin Powell cited at his big UN speech to get us into Iraq War II. This was his brother. Oh, and by the way, then they rendered him back to Gaddafi. This was when Gaddafi was complying in the terror war. He always was. And they rendered this guy, the MI6 and the CIA ended up giving him to Gaddafi, where Gaddafi later murdered him in his prison cell, and they called it a suicide. Anyway, so Obama kills his brother, Yahya, in a drone strike in Pakistan in 2012. Zawahiri puts out a podcast saying, get revenge against the Americans. So September 11, 2012 rolls around, and that's exactly what they do. Is, you know, Hillary and Obama station an American ambassador and a bunch of CIA guys right in the center of a hornet's nest in order to use those hornets against other American enemies. And then they're surprised that the guy got stung. And then meanwhile, all of that scandal got buried because the only question was, Did Hillary Clinton answer the phone at 3 a.m.? Did Barack Obama answer the phone at 3 a.m.? Did they send all available CIA and military assets as soon as possible, or did they wait 45 minutes? Or who failed at hiring enough security for these men? Without finishing the question, who was in charge of hiring enough security for these men who had been stationed in the center of a terrorist hornet's nest? And how much security do you need when you're backing Al-Qaeda and stationed among them? A lot, right? They never talked about that part of it. But that was what was going on there. Boy, I'm sorry I'm off on that tangent. But it was always bothered me how everybody was like, oh, Benghazi, like what a conspiracy. And then they missed the entire point of what's gone wrong there.
That shit pissed me off too, because my brother watched the movie and he's like, you got to watch this movie. It's so good. I'm like, do they talk about the fact that they were sending weapons to Syria? No, they don't. But the movie's really good. I'm like, then why the fuck would I want to watch the movie? I'm like, everybody's going to watch this movie. It's going to get people, upset or whatever. And it completely just avoids talking about the actual reason this attack happened. And to me, that's the most important part, because, it's quite obvious and it's common to use like embassies as CIA sites and stuff like that to do stuff. And the fact that there's so much evidence that proved that they were using it to send weapons and funds to the Syrian rebels and ISIS. I mean, it was crazy. And then I remember watching the Benghazi hearings and waiting for somebody to even bring it up, mention it, and nobody did. And it was like, no matter how much they hated Hillary, they wanted to make her look bad, but they didn't want to expose the truth. They didn't want to expose the whole plan. And it goes back to what we've been talking about, how like these ideologies don't matter. It's like that movie Network. I'm always referencing it because it's kind of like Orwell's in 1984, like it was way ahead of its time. So was Network, the movie. And when the business guy is like, there is no this or that, there's only DuPont, there's only Shell, there's only, it's all about money and power. And it's not about Republicans and Democrats. A Republican's not going to expose a Democrat if it exposes the whole game and the whole method of existing. And I think that's a huge issue. I've had Jack Abramoff on my show. Same thing. Like he tiptoed the line where he'll talk about lobbyists and he'll talk about the things that he got in trouble for, but there's still things that he'll tiptoe the line because it's like he benefited from this whole corrupt game, and I don't think it's a coincidence that a lot of lawyers end up becoming politicians and presidents and stuff like that, and they all benefit from a really just detailed, confusing, tax code and laws that are just, just way too many laws. So the only people who can really benefit from having a real complicated tax code and a lot of laws or whatever are people who have money and influences and friends to kind of manipulate that and find the loopholes, where the average person just becomes a victim to all of it.
Yeah.
Yeah. So it's really interesting. I think your book, the fact that it also starts in 79 is really important. I know people have talked about this in many of your shows, but to go back to history and how important it is. Everybody talks about the hostage crisis, another movie that people talked about in Iran, like, oh my God, they took these Americans, but nobody talks about why that happened. Nobody talks about how in the 50s when we took down their government because they didn't want to renew the lease for the oil fields and whatnot. And then they took that down, and then there's like a puppet regime, and the country was a mess, and it's sad that most Europeans or foreigners in general from Asia, wherever they are, they understand history and know history much better than America. We're too busy still talking about Christopher Columbus and the Civil War, but we're not talking about all these other things that's happened in history that has a serious effect on what's going on now with our foreign policy, and also gives us a much better understanding of why, and you need to know about the fall of the Ottoman Empire and the Sykes-Picot Agreement and how it all got carved up and all this stuff. I mean, that's once you learn that stuff, what's going on today makes much more sense. And I think that books like yours and people who really emphasize, because you talk about geopolitics and you talk about foreign policy, but you also always talk about the history that goes along with it, and I think that's really important to kind of emphasize and to talk about, because like we talked about, Korea, and we talked about all, Iraq, and you have to talk about Iraq War I, and you have to talk about the Soviets in Afghanistan, and how we funneled weapons to fight them. And now you have all these people saying, oh yeah, these guys are extremists. I'm a Christian, or I'm a Catholic, or I'm a Protestant, or I'm a whatever, but these guys are extremists. These guys are, it's like, well, we didn't have a problem them being super extreme when we're trying to use that as a motivating factor to look at these anti-religious Soviets. Like, no, we want you to be extremely religious and to hate these people because they're not, and now, it's just, and then the fact that some of the stuff is just so obvious, it's hard not to laugh at it. Like the fact that we actually think that we're going into these countries to help the women or whatever, when Saudi Arabia is publicly stoning women and beheading people, every day, and it's no big deal, and but women get to vote now in Saudi Arabia. But how the fuck do they get there? They can't drive. So it's all this just ridiculous contradictions, and I think it's really important what you're doing. But I know I've taken up a lot of your time, and you're a busy man, and it's a Friday, so you probably want to cock back a cold one eventually and enjoy yourself. And do you ever find it hard to when you're so deep in all this stuff, do you ever find it hard to like kind of detach yourself? Do you have things that hobbies and stuff that you use to kind of detach yourself? Because as you get, they've seen yourself and myself get worked up over this, because I think we are very passionate about this, and I think that some of this stuff is so obvious, and we're so upset that there isn't changes and there isn't more people upset about it, that it's hard not to get emotionally involved in these conversations. Do you find it hard, because you're obviously always researching, you're doing your radio shows, you're doing podcasts, you're doing all that stuff. Do you find it hard to detach yourself from some of this stuff?
Yeah, I mean, I am pretty workaholic. I pretty much do nothing but work. But I got a good family and good friends, whatever, so I can't complain. But I guess I will plead guilty that I did not set one foot on my skateboard all summer long this summer for the first time in my life since I was 11 years old. And so that's not okay at all. And so I'm definitely going to Skatevert next Wednesday.
How old are you, if you don't mind me asking? How old? 41. And you still skateboard?
Yeah, I'm not that good or anything, but
yeah, but that's awesome. I skateboarded because I was my brother and I we're Portuguese, and like the first instinct for my parents is push me towards soccer, and like the rebellion kid I was, I'm like, you know what? I'm gonna be everything anti what they want me to be. I'm gonna play metal music. I'm gonna listen to heavy metal. I'm gonna listen to industrial music and this dark techno and stuff like that. And I'm gonna do I BMX and skateboarded, and I wanted nothing to do with organized sports and team sports and stuff like that. And I like the creativity about it. I like the kind of being able to do it alone and by yourself, but also having the option to get along with friends and go for rides together and stuff like that. And I like the fact that it wasn't
less liberty and responsibility, isn't it?
Yeah, and you're right. And I also like the fact that the thing about like that type of world, because I remember getting the VHS's magazine. What was it? I forget what it was. You know what I'm talking about? The VHS. Yeah. And getting those and just love watching them, but it was a clique. I mean, obviously there's cliques in skateboarding. It is a tribe and whatnot, but it was one that was open to all different types of people. Like if you like skateboarding, I had buddies who listen to hip hop. I had buddies who listen to punk. I had buddies who listen to metal, and it didn't really matter. And I had buddies who were Spanish, who were black, who were
all ages too.
Yeah, and
kids and old men all riding together, and let your skateboard and do the talking. And really, whatever you try, it's 100% on you, whatever it is you're doing. And when you take the slam, you're the only one who feels that pain. And when you pull it, you're the one who gets the satisfaction that you finally nailed whatever it was that was so hard before and whatever. So, yeah, I think compared to like team sports, sitting around, like you mentioned, playing soccer. Like all I remember about playing soccer when I was a kid was just standing there and thinking, what a waste of a Saturday. This is so stupid. Like what am I doing on a team? Some other kid is kicking a ball and I'm supposed to cheer because we won, or I'm sad because we lost. I rather like lay on the concrete bleeding. At least I did it to myself. I own it,
Yeah, yeah, and I think there's also a sense of creative people being attracted to it. You know, musicians, poets, people like that, because I think you have much more room to be creative. And I mean, just look how far it's gone. I remember when I was skateboarding, BMXing. I mean, doing a one backflip on a. I remember the first time like the backflip on a BMX was like a huge fucking deal. Now they're doing it on motorcycles. You know, it's like it's fucking crazy how like they just keep pushing the limits and pushing it, and how like every year you just see like some kid just, you know, taking it to another level, and it's just phenomenal how crazy it is, like just how far they keep pushing it. Like once you think like, okay, they've done everything you could possibly do on a bike or on a skateboard, somebody will do something even crazier. And yeah, I mean, it's a beautiful thing. I think I always loved watching people who were really good at it, because again, I was like you, I did it as a hobby. I was never really that good at it. You know, I could do a kickflip, I could do a ollie all right, but I was never really that good at it. But I loved watching people who were. I mean, it was like poetry in motion, you know, just seeing everything flow and just like, you know, being able to be creative where you get off the rail and you decide how you want to grind on the rail and you decide how you want to come off the rail. Like I loved all of that, the spontaneousness of it, the creativity of it. And you know, it does seem like it's not quite as popular as maybe it was when I was growing up, but that's probably because I've been out of the scene quite a bit. But you know, but I loved everything about it, and I think that it doesn't get enough credit from the outside world for the creativity and the balls that it takes to even do it. Because I mean, if I miss a goal playing soccer, or I miss a 3-pointer playing basketball, you know, nothing happens. But if I miss, going off a jump, or I land wrong or something like that, I'm taking a shitter, you know, and it's gonna hurt, you know. So the consequences are much higher.
Well, especially for the very best guys. I mean, they're doing huge stairs and huge airs, and you know, vert ramps now standard are 14 feet, and these guys are doing, you know, soy style airs on every wall, or soy sized airs on every wall. Don't hang up, man. Jesus. Yeah, you're right. I mean, and the pro street skaters now, like, you got to be able to do a backside flip down 25 stairs, dude, or, you know, some insane, impossible thing. So I don't know how anybody could even. You got to be really gifted to be a pro street skater now. I mean, the competition is just insane for how good these kids are now. It's totally
absolutely. And the other thing I love about it is that, you know, the guys, it's not like team sports where you get a contract and you end up sucking, and because you already got paid, so you're not motivated. These guys are motivated every competition because that's their paycheck, and they have to perform, and they can't depend on anybody else. They can't, you know, and you know, I think it's probably one of the hardest things to make a living doing, you know, and it's really hard. It's a lot of traveling, and you really got to love what you do. But I think that's what makes these the most amazing people are motivated not by money, but by their love of their work. I mean, you talk about you're a workaholic. You know, I'm sure you love skateboarding, but I'm sure this is you don't do this because of the financial gain. You do this because because there's many of other things that I'm sure you could make much more money doing. You do it because you're passionate, and you really feel like you're, you know, I called this podcast Ripple Effect Podcast because I truly believe people like yourself, people like myself, anybody who's taking time out of their day and putting effort and energy in spreading these interesting conversations and interesting thoughts and ideas, I think we're all creating a ripple, and we never know how big that ripple is going to turn out. And you never know who you're influencing. I mean, how many people who are going to be future politicians, or future, who knows, somebody who's going to change the world could be inspired by you, just like somebody who inspired you growing up, you know, doesn't realize that they inspired Scott Horton, or they, you know. So I think we never know who we're touching and who we're affecting. But you know, I think the most dangerous thing is to believe that we can't make a difference. When we have already lost once we believe we can't make a difference, and I think so. That's kind of what I keep telling my listeners, and I keep telling people. And this show is a perfect example. I've brought up some of the guests that have been on the show. I'm a fucking kid who barely graduated high school. Like yourself, I was a skateboarder and BMXer. The teachers didn't like me because, you know, I walked in with like a Iron Maiden shirt or a Slayer shirt, and they already like, oh, this kid's gonna be a fuck up, and oh, he must be a hands-on student because he doesn't want to pay. No, man, like you don't keep my attention because you suck at teaching. You're not getting this information across in an interesting way. And it took me a long time to figure that out. It took me till after school. It's funny because I have friends call me like a history buff, and then I'm like, you do realize in school, history was my worst subject, and so it's like, it wasn't that I hated history. I just didn't realize that it was. They were doing a shitty job getting that information across to me and keep me interested. So I think that's really important. I think a lot of times people like to look at somebody's resume and whatnot, or prejudge people by the way they look, or what they, how much money they make, or the diploma, wherever that diploma's from. But I like to just look, have conversations with people and judge them based on their ideas, and all that other shit doesn't really matter, So I'm sure, just like myself, you've probably met some really interesting people who aren't famous or aren't rich or aren't whatever, but have really interesting ideas and real well thought out opinions on stuff. And I think, so it doesn't matter. Any of that other stuff isn't really relevant.
Right. Yeah. I mean, I'm willing to settle for making a difference on the margin. I think that's basically the deal, right? Like, I'm going to be able to get through to some people, and that's cool. Whether actually, history is any different because I was here or not, like, probably not. And I'm not really too hung up about that. If I could stop a war, I sure will keep trying to. But as long as people are still saying, yeah, well, I used to think I had to be a warmonger. Thanks for, like, what a weight that was on my shoulders all the time. And now I don't have to deal with that. Like, I'm willing to settle for that. I know some guys quit the military because they heard me. I know some people, used to be bad on this stuff and now they're not. So I'm willing to take that. I'm not too hung up on the rest of that. Like Ron Paul says, hey, just do your best. Keep teaching people about liberty and what's really going on around here. And no point in predicting the worst or getting too hung up on the immediate results of your work. Just keep doing the right thing and don't worry about it,
Yeah, and I completely agree. I mean, I think that a lot of the people I love, like yourself, it seems like, that's their thing. They're like, they just keep doing what they're doing. They're not really worried about the results. They're not worried about, but in your heart, you feel like, it's much easier to go to bed at night knowing that you've attempted and you're trying to do something than it is to go to bed thinking, like, what am I fucking contributing? I mean, that's why I started this podcast, because I'm like, I have a full-time job. I'm like, I go to work, I come home, I have a couple of hobbies, this and that, but what am I contributing to try to make the world a little better than it was? And even if it's just a little bit of, a little bit of something, it's better than nothing, and I'll be much happier with myself. So, but thanks a lot, Scott. I really appreciate it. Love the show. Everybody subscribe to it. Obviously, the book is available everywhere. And thanks again.
Fool's Errand, everybody.
Fool's Errand. Time to End the War in Afghanistan, and it's an amazing book. You've heard plenty of other people who've on this show also talk about how great the book is. So definitely.
That's nice.
Yeah, it's awesome. So definitely check it out, because it really is a book that there's not a whole lot of people publicly who continue talking about it. It's like the sexy topic is like Syria and Russia, and but Afghanistan's kind of, like I said in the beginning of the show, it's like starting to turn into the forgotten war, like Korea. So but thanks again. Enjoy your weekend. I really appreciate you taking time to be with me, and keep up the great work, and hopefully we touch bases again in the near future.
Yeah, absolutely, man. It was really nice, and I really appreciate it, and you have a good weekend, too.
Hey, thanks, Scott. Take care.
Ready? Thanks.